Hi, my name is Natasha. And 3 weeks ago, I discovered my parents weren't just selling my childhood home behind my back. They were using the money to bail out my brother's third failed business while telling everyone I was too selfish to help family. What they didn't know was that I'd already bought the mortgage on their dream retirement home at auction 6 months earlier. Sometimes the people who taught you about trust are the same ones who teach you why you shouldn't give it so freely. Tonight, I'm not here to destroy them. I'm here to show them what real family loyalty looks like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against my office windows on the 32nd floor of the Morrison Financial Building, each drop creating tiny rivers that distorted the Portland skyline below. I'd been staring at the same spreadsheet for 20 minutes, my mind wandering between quarterly projections and the nagging feeling that something was shifting in my carefully ordered world. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, but I kept lifting it to my lips anyway, a mechanical gesture that helped me think through the complex portfolio of distressed assets I managed for high-net-worth clients. My phone buzzed against the polished mahogany of my desk, displaying a text from my college roommate. Zoe, saw your parents at Home Depot yesterday. Your mom mentioned they're finally downsizing. Excited for their new place, the message felt innocent enough, but something about it made my stomach clench. My parents hadn't mentioned anything about downsizing to me, and we spoke every Sunday without fail. Sure, the conversations had become increasingly strained over the past year, especially after I'd refused to invest in Marcus's latest restaurant venture, but they'd never kept major life decisions from me before. I set my phone down and tried to refocus on the numbers dancing across my screen, but concentration had abandoned me entirely. The feeling gnawed at me like hunger, growing stronger with each passing minute. My parents, Richard and Carol Reeves, had lived in the same house on Maple Ridge Drive for 35 years. It was where I'd taken my first steps, where I'd practiced piano recitals that echoed through the hardwood hallways, where I'd cried over broken hearts and celebrated college acceptance letters. The idea of them selling it without even mentioning it felt like finding out about a death through a newspaper obituary. By 5 o'clock, I couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. I grabbed my coat from the back of my chair and headed for the elevator, my heels clicking against the marble floors with purposeful determination. The drive from downtown Portland to Millbrook took 45 minutes in good traffic, but I barely noticed the passing landscape. My mind kept cycling through possible explanations. Maybe they'd mentioned it and I'd forgotten. Maybe Zoe had misunderstood what she'd overheard. Maybe they were just exploring options and hadn't made any concrete decisions yet. The familiar streets of my hometown felt different somehow, as if I were seeing them through a lens that had shifted slightly out of focus. I drove past the elementary school where I'd learned to read, past the park where my grandfather Vincent had taught me to throw a curveball, past the old hardware store that had been the foundation of our family's modest wealth. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, faded around the edges like photographs left too long in direct sunlight. When I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, my heart began to race with an intensity that surprised me. The street looked exactly as it always had, lined with mature oak trees that created a canopy of green even in late autumn. But as I approached the familiar white colonial with blue shutters that had been my sanctuary for the first 18 years of my life, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. A red and white for sale sign stood planted firmly in the front yard like a declaration of war. Hartwell Real Estate. It proclaimed in bold letters with a phone number I didn't recognize, and a small photo of a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that probably sold 1,000 houses a year. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine running, windshield wipers clearing away the persistent drizzle as I stared at that sign and tried to process what I was seeing. The house itself looked immaculate, better than I'd seen it in years. The shutters had been freshly painted, the lawn was manicured to country club standards, and someone had planted new flowers along the walkway. They'd even replaced the old brass mailbox with a sleek black one that matched the newly painted front door. It was clear that significant time, effort, and money had been invested in preparing the house for sale. This wasn't a sudden decision or a casual exploration of options. This was a calculated plan that had been in motion for months. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for another few minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. The familiar sound of the garage door opener echoed from inside the house, followed by the slam of a car door. My mother appeared around the corner of the house, carrying several shopping bags and wearing the kind of bright smile that she usually reserved for church functions and dinner parties. When she saw my car, the smile faltered for just a moment, before reassembling itself into something that looked practiced and hollow. "Natasha, sweetheart," she called out, her voice carrying across the driveway with forced cheerfulness. "What a wonderful surprise. We weren't expecting you." She approached my car window, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the quick mental adjustment that people make when they're caught off guard and need to recalibrate their approach to a conversation they'd hoped to avoid. I rolled down my window and gestured toward the for sale sign. "Apparently there are a lot of things you weren't expecting me to know about." My voice came out steadier than I felt, but I could hear the edge of hurt underneath the words. "When were you planning to tell me you were selling the house?" Her smile became even more artificial, stretching across her face like plastic wrap. "Oh, that. Well, you know how these things go. We've been thinking about it for a while, and when Diana Hartwell said the market was perfect, we just decided to test the waters. Nothing's set in stone, of course." She shifted the shopping bags from one arm to the other, a nervous gesture I recognized from childhood. She always rearranged things when she was about to tell a lie or avoid a difficult truth. "Test the water," I repeated, climbing out of my car and closing the door with perhaps more force than necessary. "Mom, you've completely renovated the exterior, staged the property, and hired what looks like a pretty expensive real estate agent. This isn't testing waters, this is diving into the deep end." Before she could respond, the front door opened and my father emerged, his face brightening when he saw me before quickly shifting into the same guarded expression my mother wore. Richard Reeves had always been a straightforward man, uncomfortable with deception and terrible at hiding his emotions. The guilt was written across his features like graffiti on a wall. "Tasha," he said, walking toward us with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Good to see you, kiddo." The nickname felt forced, like he was trying to summon a familiarity that had somehow gotten lost in recent months. "Your mother told you about the house? She was just explaining how you're testing the waters," I said, making air quotes with my finger. "Though I have to say, for a test, you've certainly committed a lot of resources to it." My parents exchanged a look that communicated volumes, one of those silent conversations that couples develop over decades of marriage. I'd seen that look countless times growing up, usually right before they delivered news that they knew I wouldn't like. The piano lessons were too expensive. The summer camp was already full. The college I dreamed of attending was too far away. "Why don't we go inside and talk about this properly?" my father suggested, already turning toward the house. "No point in having this conversation in the driveway where the whole neighborhood can hear." The interior of the house had been transformed as thoroughly as the exterior. Furniture I'd grown up with had been replaced or rearranged, family photos had been carefully curated and relocated, and the warm lived-in feeling that had always characterized my childhood home had been replaced with something that looked like a magazine spread. Even the familiar smells were different. Gone were the lingering aromas of my mother's cooking and my father's aftershave, replaced by the artificial scents of vanilla candles and industrial-strength cleaning products. We settled in the living room, my parents on the sofa they'd owned for 15 years, but had apparently reupholstered in neutral beige, while I took the wingback chair that used to belong to my grandmother. The chair was one of the few things that remained unchanged, and sitting in it made me feel connected to something solid and enduring in a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. "The truth is," my mother began, folding her hands in her lap with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this speech, "we've been thinking about downsizing for a couple of years now. The house is too big for just the two of us, and the maintenance is becoming more than we want to handle. We found a lovely place at Sunset Meadows, one of those active adult communities with a golf course and all sorts of activities." Sunset Meadows, I knew the development she was referring to. It was expensive, the kind of place where the entry fees alone could fund a college education. "That's not downsizing, Mom. That's upgrading to a lifestyle you can't afford on Dad's pension." My father shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, his fingers drumming against his knee in a nervous rhythm. Well, that's where the house sale comes in. The equity we've built up here will more than cover the buy-in at Sunset Meadows, plus give us a nice cushion for the future. Something in his tone made my suspicions sharp. I'd spent years analyzing financial statements and reading between the lines of corporate speak, and I could smell evasion from a mile away. Dad, Sunset Meadows requires $250,000 entry fee, plus monthly costs that are probably more than your current mortgage payment. Even with this house selling at market value, which has to be close to $400,000, you'd be cutting things pretty close. We've run the numbers, my mother said quickly, but her voice had taken on a defensive quality that suggested the numbers weren't as solid as she wanted me to believe. Diana assured us that everything would work out fine. Diana, the real estate agent, assured you that your finances would work out fine. I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. Mom, real estate agents aren't financial planners. Their job is to sell houses, not to make sure you can afford your retirement. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths and careful calculations. I watched my parents' faces, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed their discomfort. My mother's eyes kept darting toward my father, silently urging him to say something, while my father stared at his hands as if they held the answers to questions he didn't want to ask. There's something else, isn't there? I said finally, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. This isn't just about downsizing or wanting to live in an active adult community. What aren't you telling me? Another exchange of looks, another silent conversation filled with 35 years of shared secrets and difficult decisions. Finally, my father cleared his throat and met my eyes with the kind of resigned expression that people wear when they know they're about to disappoint someone they love. Marcus is going through a rough patch, he said quietly. The restaurant isn't doing as well as he'd hoped, and he's behind on some payments. We're helping him get back on his feet. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. Marcus, my older brother by 3 years, had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, despite a track record of failed ventures and financial irresponsibility that stretched back to his college days. This was his third attempt at running a restaurant, and like the previous two, it was apparently heading toward spectacular failure. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. It's not that simple, my mother said, her voice taking on the pleading quality she'd always used when she wanted me to be understanding about Marcus's latest crisis. He just needs enough to cover the lease payments and keep the doors open until business picks up. It's a loan, not a gift. He'll pay us back once things turn around. How much, Mom? $60,000, my father said quietly, the words falling into the room like stones into still water. Maybe a little more, depending on what other debts surfaced. I sat back in my grandmother's chair, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. $60,000 was more than many people made in a year, and my parents were planning to hand it over to my brother, whose business acumen could generously be described as optimistic, and more accurately characterized as delusional. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, my voice carefully controlled despite the fury building inside me. You're selling the house I grew up in, the house where you've lived for 35 years to fund Marcus's third failed restaurant attempt, and you were planning to do this without even telling me about it. We knew you'd react this way, my mother said, her tone becoming defensive. You've never supported Marcus's dreams, and we didn't want to get into another argument about family loyalty. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Family loyalty. As if I hadn't been the one who'd helped them navigate the insurance maze when my father had his heart attack 5 years ago. As if I hadn't been the one who'd driven down from Portland every weekend for 3 months to help my mother manage his recovery. As if I hadn't been the one who'd quietly paid for the roof repairs last spring, when they thought their homeowner's insurance wouldn't cover the storm damage. Family loyalty, I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I've been nothing but loyal to this family. I'm the one who's never asked you for money, never moved back home when things got tough, never expected you to bail me out of my own mistake. And now you're questioning my loyalty, because I don't want to throw good money after bad into Marcus's latest fantasy. It's not a fantasy, my father said, but his heart clearly wasn't in the defense. The location has good foot traffic, and the concept is solid. He just needs time to build up a customer base. Dad, this is the same thing you said about the sports bar that failed after 8 months and the food truck that got repossessed after 6. Marcus doesn't need more money, he needs to face reality and get a job that comes with a steady paycheck. The conversation continued in circles for another hour, with my parents alternating between justifying their decision and trying to convince me that I was being unreasonably harsh in my assessment of Marcus's business prospects. Nothing I said seemed to penetrate their determination to rescue their son from the consequences of his own poor decisions, and nothing they said could convince me that this plan was anything other than financial suicide disguised as parental love. When I finally left that evening, the rain had intensified into a steady downpour that matched my mood perfectly. I sat in my car in the driveway for several minutes before starting the engine, staring at the house that would soon belong to strangers while my parents moved into an overpriced retirement community they couldn't afford in order to fund my brother's inevitable failure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive back to Portland felt longer than usual, every mile stretching out like an accusation. How had I not seen this coming? How had I been so blind to the financial strain my parents were under, and how had I missed the signs that they were planning something this drastic? More importantly, how could they have made such a momentous decision without even consulting me, let alone informing me about it? By the time I reached my downtown condo, I'd made a decision of my own. I wasn't going to stand by and watch my parents destroy their financial security for the sake of enabling Marcus's delusion. I wasn't going to let them sell the house that represented 3 decades of memories and careful investment, just so my brother could avoid the harsh realities of adult responsibility. I had resources they didn't know about, knowledge they couldn't access, and connections they'd never imagined. For the past 6 months, I'd been quietly acquiring distressed mortgages through a shell company I'd established, purchasing them at auction from banks that wanted to clear their books of non-performing loans. It was a lucrative side business that had grown from a small experiment into a significant source of passive income. What my parents didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the mortgage on their dream retirement home at Sunset Meadows had been sold to a collection agency 3 months ago when the original lender had gone through a bankruptcy reorganization. And what they really couldn't have known was that I'd purchased that mortgage at auction just 2 weeks ago for 35 cents on the dollar. I owned the debt on the retirement home they were planning to buy with the proceeds from selling my childhood home. I held the paper on their future, and they had no idea that their daughter had become their creditor. As I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my home office to review the mortgage documents I'd filed away, I felt a sense of clarity that had been missing from my life for months. My parents had taught me many things over the years: the value of hard work, the importance of education, the power of careful financial planning. They'd also taught me, perhaps without meaning to, that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones most willing to exclude you from the decisions that affect your life. Tomorrow, I would begin to show them what those lessons looked like when they were applied by someone who had learned them well. I would demonstrate that family loyalty was a two-way street, and that trust, once broken, came with consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings and uncomfortable conversations. The game was about to change, and for the first time in months, I held all the cards. The next morning arrived gray and unforgiving, with the kind of Pacific Northwest drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there all day. I'd barely slept, my mind churning through memories I'd thought I'd filed away years ago. The coffee maker gurgled to life at 6:30, an automated ritual that usually brought comfort but today felt mechanical and hollow. I stood at my kitchen window watching the city wake up 32 floors below, and felt the weight of 32 years of family history pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent my entire career analyzing other people's financial disasters, helping wealthy clients navigate the treacherous waters of investment losses and market volatility, while completely missing the signs of impending catastrophe in my own family. But then again, when you're conditioned from childhood to believe that certain topics are off limits, that certain decisions are made by certain people without input from others, you learn to look away from the things that might require uncomfortable conversation. I pulled my laptop onto the kitchen counter and opened the file I'd created 6 months ago when I'd first started acquiring distressed mortgages. The Sunset Meadows property was listed as Unit 247, a 2-bedroom townhouse with a golf course view and access to all the community amenities that made the place so expensive. The original mortgage had been for $280,000, taken out by a couple named Henderson, who'd apparently overestimated their ability to afford the monthly payment. When they'd defaulted after 18 months, the property had gone into foreclosure, and the mortgage had been bundled with dozens of others and sold to a collection agency at a fraction of its face value. I'd purchased the entire bundle for $47,000, a collection of bad debts that most investors avoided because of the time and effort required to collect on them. But I'd seen potential in the Sunset Meadows properties specifically, knowing that the retirement community was popular and that someone would eventually want to buy into it. I just hadn't imagined that someone would be my own parent. The documentation was all there, neatly organized in digital folders that told the story of financial decisions made by people who'd thought they were smarter than the market. Purchase agreements, mortgage applications, payment histories, foreclosure notices, auction records. The paper trail that would allow me to control my parents' future without them having any idea that their daughter held the keys to their dreams. I closed the laptop and poured another cup of coffee, trying to decide how much of the past I needed to excavate before I could move forward. The truth was that Marcus had been the golden child for so long that I'd almost forgotten there was a time when things had been different, when my parents had looked at both their children with equal pride and expectation. But that time felt like ancient history now, buried under years of excuses and explanations, and an ever-widening gap between the son, who could do no wrong, and the daughter who somehow never did quite enough. It had started in high school, though the seeds had probably been planted much earlier. Marcus had been a decent athlete, good enough to play varsity baseball but not good enough to attract college scouts. He'd been a mediocre student, hovering around a B- average, despite having access to the same tutors and study resources I'd used to maintain my position at the top of our class. But he'd been charming and social and popular in ways that I'd never been, and our parents had seemed to believe that charisma would somehow translate into success in the adult world. When college time came, I'd earned a full academic scholarship to Portland State, where I'd double majored in finance and economics, while working 20 hours a week at a campus job to cover my living expenses. Marcus had chosen to attend an expensive private college, 3 states away, majoring in business administration with a minor in what he'd called networking opportunity. Our parents had taken out a second mortgage on the house to pay his tuition, something I'd only learned years later when I'd helped them refinance after my father's heart attack. The pattern had continued after graduation. I'd started at the bottom of the investment world, working 14-hour days as an analyst at a small firm, living in a studio apartment that was smaller than my childhood bedroom and eating ramen noodles for dinner more often than I cared to admit. But I'd been building something, creating a foundation that would support the career I'd dreamed about since I was 12 years old and had first understood what compound interest could do for someone who was patient and disciplined enough to let it work. Marcus, meanwhile, had moved back home after college and spent 2 years finding himself while working part-time at our father's hardware store. When he'd finally announced that he'd found his calling in the restaurant industry, our parents had been so relieved that he'd chosen a direction that they'd immediately offered to help him get started. The first restaurant had been a family-style place in downtown Millbrook, serving comfort food to a community that already had 3 other restaurants serving essentially the same menu. It had lasted 14 months before closing due to what Marcus had characterized as market conditions beyond our control. The second venture had been the sports bar, located near the community college in what Marcus had insisted was an underserved market. He'd been right about the market being underserved, but he'd been wrong about the reasons why. College students didn't have the disposable income to support a business that charged premium prices for basic bar food, and the older residents of Millbrook weren't particularly interested in watching sports in an establishment that played music loud enough to make conversation impossible. That venture had lasted 8 months, and had left Marcus with debts that our parents had quietly helped him resolve. The food truck had been his attempt to reduce overhead and target a more mobile customer base. He'd spent months researching locations and menu options, creating business plans that looked impressive on paper but hadn't accounted for the realities of food service regulations, insurance costs, and the fact that operating a mobile restaurant required skills he didn't possess. When the truck had been repossessed, Marcus had spent 3 months sleeping in his childhood bedroom while he figured out his next move. Through all of this, I'd watched from the sidelines, offering practical advice that was ignored and financial assistance that was never requested. When I'd suggested that Marcus might benefit from working for someone else's restaurant before trying to open his own, I'd been told that I didn't understand his entrepreneurial spirit. When I'd offered to help him create a realistic business plan based on actual market research rather than optimistic projections, I'd been accused of being unsupportive and pessimistic. The most frustrating part had been watching our parents enable every failure with the kind of unconditional financial support they'd never offered me. When I'd needed help with graduate school tuition, I'd been told that student loans would teach me responsibility and help me appreciate my education. When Marcus needed help with restaurant equipment, our parents had liquidated their savings account without hesitation. When I'd saved up to buy my first house at 26, I'd been congratulated for my independence and self-sufficiency. When Marcus had needed help avoiding bankruptcy at 29, our parents had taken out a home equity loan to cover his debt. The double standard had been so consistent and so carefully maintained that I'd eventually stopped pointing it out. What was the use in arguing with people who had convinced themselves that supporting their son's dreams was different from enabling his irresponsibility? What was the point in trying to make them see that their unwillingness to let Marcus fail was actually preventing him from learning the lessons that might eventually lead to success? I'd learned to manage my expectations and protect my emotional investment in family dynamics that were apparently set in stone. I'd built a life in Portland that was independent and successful, and largely separate from the ongoing drama of Marcus's latest crisis. I thought I'd made peace with being the responsible child who asked for nothing and received recognition for her achievements in the form of proud mentions at dinner parties, rather than practical support when it might have made a difference. But discovering that they were willing to sell the house I'd grown up in to fund his latest venture had broken something inside me that I hadn't even realized was still vulnerable. It wasn't just about the money, though $60,000 was a significant sum by any measure. It wasn't even about the house, though the idea of strangers living in the rooms where I'd spent my childhood felt like a violation of something sacred. It was about the realization that my parents saw Marcus's dreams as worth preserving at any cost, while my attachment to the family home was apparently not worth a conversation. It was about understanding that they'd rather bet their financial security on his unproven track record than consider the possibility that I might have opinions worth hearing about decisions that affected all of. It was about recognizing that after 32 years, I was still the child whose needs came second, whose feelings were less important, whose voice carried less weight in the family discussions that shaped our collective future. I finished my coffee and spent the next hour reviewing my investment portfolio, checking market positions and assessing the performance of various holdings. Numbers had always been my sanctuary, a world where logic prevailed over emotion, and where careful analysis usually led to predictable outcomes. In the financial markets, patterns could be identified and exploited, risks could be calculated and managed, and success generally correlated with preparation and discipline rather than luck or charm. By 9 o'clock I'd made my decision about how to spend the day. I needed to understand exactly what my parents had committed to at Sunset Meadows, and I needed to know the full scope of Marcus's financial situation before I decided how to proceed. Information was power, and I'd spent years learning how to gather intelligence without revealing my intention. The drive to Millbrook took longer than usual due to morning traffic, but I used the time to make phone calls that would set the day's agenda in motion. My first call was to Patricia Wong at First National Bank, where my parents had maintained their accounts for over 20 years. Patricia and I had developed a professional relationship over the years, as I'd helped several of her clients with investment strategies, and she was willing to share general information about market conditions and lending practices without violating privacy regulation. I'm seeing a lot of older clients getting involved in retirement community purchases, she told me when I explained that I was researching the market for a potential investment opportunity. The entry fees have gotten pretty steep, and some of these places require significant ongoing monthly payments on top of the initial buy-in. A lot of folks are having to liquidate assets or take on debt to make it work. My second call was to Diana Hartwell, the real estate agent whose sign was planted in my parents' front yard. I identified myself as a potential investor interested in properties in the Maple Ridge neighborhood, and asked about market conditions and pricing trends. Diana was eager to share information about her current listings, including a beautiful colonial that was priced to move quickly due to the seller's timeline constraint. The owners are highly motivated, she explained with the kind of enthusiasm that real estate agents reserved for situations where they sensed a quick commission. They've already identified their next property and need to close by the end of next month to secure their finance. It's a great opportunity for someone who can move fast. The third call was to James Park, the attorney who'd helped me set up the shell company I used for mortgage acquisition. James specialized in real estate law and had connections throughout the industry that made him an invaluable resource for understanding the legal landscape of property transactions. Sunset Meadows has been in the news lately, he told me when I mentioned the retirement community. They've been having some financial difficulties, and there are rumors that they might be changing their fee structure or even selling to a larger management company. If your parents are thinking about buying in, they might want to get a lawyer to review the contract carefully. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle I was assembling, and by the time I reached Millbrook, I had a much clearer picture of the situation my parents had created for themselves. They'd committed to purchasing a property in a financially unstable retirement community, using proceeds from a house sale that they needed to complete quickly to meet their financing deadlines, all to generate cash they could use to subsidize a business venture with virtually no chance of success. It was exactly the kind of financial decision-making that I helped my clients avoid, the sort of over-leveraged, time-sensitive arrangement that created vulnerability and eliminated options. My parents had managed to put themselves in a position where they had no room for error, no backup plans, and no realistic way to change course if any part of their plan failed to work out as expected. I drove past Marcus's current restaurant, a place called Fusion Flavors that occupied a narrow storefront in what had once been Millbrook's thriving downtown district. The area had been struggling for years as shopping patterns shifted toward the big box stores on the outskirts of town, and several of the neighboring businesses displayed for rent signs that looked like they'd been there for months. Even from the street, I could see that the restaurant appeared to be closed despite the fact that it was nearly lunchtime on a Thursday. I parked across the street and spent several minutes observing the building, noting the lack of customers, the dim interior lighting, and the general air of abandonment that seemed to cling to the place like fog. A small sign in the window indicated that they were temporarily closed for renovations, but the dust on the glass and the pile of mail visible through the door suggested that the closure had been anything but temporary. This was the business my parents were sacrificing their financial security to save. This empty restaurant with its optimistic name and its closed doors and its pile of unpaid bills was worth more to them than the house where they'd raised their children and built their life together. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me sitting in my car across from my brother's failed dream, trying to understand how love could make intelligent people make such catastrophically poor decisions. I spent the rest of the morning gathering information from sources throughout Millbrook, painting a picture of Marcus's financial situation that was even worse than I'd imagined. The restaurant owed money to suppliers, landlords, utility companies, and at least 3 different lenders who'd been convinced to provide equipment financing based on projections that had proven to be wildly optimistic. The $60,000 my parents thought would solve his problems wouldn't even cover half of his outstanding debts. By afternoon, I had enough information to understand that my parents weren't just making a bad decision. They were walking into a financial disaster that would destroy their retirement security without actually solving the problem they thought they were addressing. Marcus's business was beyond salvation, and no amount of family money was going to change that fundamental reality. The question now was what I was going to do with the knowledge I'd acquired and the power I'd accidentally accumulated. I held the mortgage on their future home, which meant I could control the terms of their occupancy and potentially prevent them from completing the purchase altogether. I had detailed knowledge of Marcus's financial situation, which meant I could present them with evidence of just how hopeless his business prospects really were. I had the resources to offer alternative solutions that might preserve their financial security while still addressing their desire to help their son. But I also had 32 years of experience with a family dynamic that had never valued my input, never sought my advice, and never acknowledged that I might have something worthwhile to contribute to important decisions. I had a lifetime of being the responsible child who was expected to understand and support choices that directly affected my life, but were made without my participation. As I drove back toward Portland that evening, I realized that this situation represented more than just a financial crisis that needed to be resolved. It was an opportunity to fundamentally change the way my family operated, to force conversations that had been avoided for years, and to demonstrate that love without respect was ultimately destructive for everyone involved. The little girl who had learned to be self-sufficient because no one was coming to help her had grown into a woman with the resources and knowledge to help herself and others. But she'd also learned that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for people was to refuse to enable their worst decisions, even when those people were your own family. The game was about to change in ways my parents couldn't imagine, and for the first time in years I was going to make sure my voice was heard in the family conversations that shaped our collective future. They'd taught me to be independent and self-reliant, and now they were about to discover what those lessons looked like when they were applied by someone who'd learned them too well. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by certified mail to my downtown office, with the kind of official weight that made my assistant knock on my door rather than simply placing it in my inbox. The return address showed the law offices of Morrison, Klein & Associates, a firm I recognized as specialist in estate planning and real estate transactions. Inside, printed on heavy cream paper with embossed letterhead, was a formal notice that my parents had executed a power of attorney designating Marcus as their primary financial representative in all matters related to the sale of their home and the purchase of their retirement property. I read the document 3 times before the full implications settled into my consciousness like stones sinking through deep water. Not only had my parents excluded me from their decision-making process, they had legally formalized my exclusion by granting my brother the authority to act on their behalf in all financial matters related to their major life transition. The man who had failed at every business venture he'd attempted, who couldn't manage his own finances well enough to keep a restaurant open for more than a few months, now held legal control over our parents' most significant assets. The timing wasn't coincidental. The document was dated the day after my visit to their house, which meant they'd driven straight to their attorney's office after our conversation and made arrangements to ensure that I couldn't interfere with their plans, even if I'd wanted to. It was a preemptive strike designed to neutralize any influence I might have tried to exert, a legal barrier constructed to keep the responsible child away from decisions that required adult supervision. I set the letter down on my desk and leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Portland skyline while trying to process the emotions churning through my chest. Hurt, certainly, but also something deeper and more complicated. Relief, perhaps, that they'd finally made their priorities explicit. And underneath it all, a growing sense of anticipation that felt almost predatory in its intensity. They thought they'd outmaneuvered me by giving Marcus legal authority over their affair. What they didn't understand was that Marcus now had legal responsibility for decisions that were about to become much more complicated than anyone had anticipated. When the mortgage company for their Sunset Meadows property started making demands that couldn't be satisfied with optimistic projections and family goodwill, it would be Marcus who'd have to find solutions. When the financial realities of their situation became unavoidable, it would be his name on the documents that acknowledged their inability to fulfill their commitment. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the mortgage documentation for the Sunset Meadows property, familiarizing myself with every clause and condition that would govern my parents' attempt to purchase their retirement home. The original loan had been structured as a balloon payment mortgage, with relatively low monthly payments for the first 2 years, followed by a significant increase designed to force refinancing or full payment. The Henderson family had defaulted when the payment increase had kicked in, unable to qualify for refinancing due to changes in their financial situation. When I'd purchased the mortgage at auction, I'd inherited all the rights and obligations of the original lender, including the authority to modify payment terms, demand additional collateral, or accelerate the loan if the borrowers failed to meet their obligation. Most importantly, I had the right to approve or deny any assumption of the mortgage by new buyers, which meant my parents couldn't complete their purchase without my explicit consent. The irony was almost perfect. Marcus now had the legal authority to act on our parents' behalf, but I held the actual power to determine whether their plans could succeed. They'd maneuvered to exclude me from their decision-making process, just as I'd positioned myself to control the outcome of their decision. It was like watching a chess game where your opponents thought they'd captured your queen while failing to notice that you'd moved into checkmate position. I called Zoe during my lunch break, needing to talk through the situation with someone who understood the family dynamics but wasn't emotionally invested in the outcome. Zoe had been my roommate through college and graduate school, and she'd witnessed enough Reeves family gatherings to understand the complex web of expectations and disappointments that characterized our interaction. They gave Marcus power of attorney? She said, her voice rising with disbelief. The same Marcus who called you last year asking for advice about whether he should declare bankruptcy. The very same, I confirmed, pulling up the legal document on my computer screen. Apparently, they trust his judgment more than they value my input. Have you told them yet that you own the mortgage on their retirement home? Not yet. I'm still deciding how and when to reveal that particular piece of information. Zoe was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her thinking through the implications. She'd always been the more impulsive of the two of us, quick to anger and equally quick to action when she felt someone had been wronged, but she'd also learned to appreciate the strategic value of patience, especially when dealing with people who'd underestimated your capabilities. You know, she said finally, there's something almost poetic about this whole situation. They've spent years treating you like your opinions don't matter, and now they're going to discover that your financial resources matter more than their opinions. It's not about revenge, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I wasn't entirely sure they were true. It's about preventing them from making a catastrophic mistake that will destroy their financial security. Of course it's about revenge, Zoe replied with the kind of blunt honesty that had made her invaluable as a friend for over a decade. And there's nothing wrong with. Sometimes people need to experience consequences before they're willing to acknowledge that their behavior has been problematic. After we ended the call, I spent the afternoon researching Marcus's current financial situation in more detail, using the professional databases and investigation resources available to me through my work. What I discovered was even worse than I'd initially suspected. The restaurant hadn't just failed, it had failed spectacularly, leaving behind a trail of unpaid debts, angry creditors, and legal obligations that would follow Marcus for years. He owed money to food suppliers who'd trusted him with credit based on his family connection. He owed rent to a landlord who'd given him favorable terms because of his father's reputation in the community. He owed payments to equipment leasing companies, utility providers, insurance companies, and at least 2 different small business lenders who'd been convinced to extend credit based on business plans that had proven to be completely detached from reality. The total amount of his outstanding obligations was well over $100,000, which meant the $60,000 our parents were planning to give him wouldn't even bring his accounts current, let alone provide the working capital he'd need to reopen the restaurant. He was financially underwater to a degree that made recovery virtually impossible, and yet our parents were preparing to sacrifice their own financial security to throw more money into a sinking ship. More troubling was the discovery that Marcus had already started using our parents' house as collateral for some of his business debt. I found records showing that he'd persuaded them to sign personal guarantees for several of his loans, putting their home equity at risk if his business failed to make payment. It appeared that the sale of the house wasn't just about generating cash to help Marcus. It was about liquidating the asset before creditors could claim it to satisfy his outstanding obligation. The picture that emerged from my investigation was of a family financial crisis that was much more serious than anyone had acknowledged. Marcus wasn't just struggling with a temporary cash flow problem that could be solved with a one-time infusion of capital. He was drowning in debt that threatened to pull our parents down with him, and their proposed solution would accelerate rather than prevent their financial destruction. By evening, I'd made my decision about how to proceed. I wasn't going to reveal my ownership of the Sunset Meadows mortgage immediately, but I was going to use my knowledge to guide the conversation in directions that would expose the flaws in their planning. I was going to force them to confront realities they'd been avoiding and ask questions they'd been unwilling to consider, and I was going to do it in a way that made it impossible for them to dismiss my concerns as unsupportive pessimism. I called my parents that night, adopting the tone of concerned daughter rather than angry adversary. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the cautious wariness that had characterized our interactions since my discovery of the for sale sign. "Hi, Mom," I said, settling into the comfortable chair in my home office. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day and I wanted to apologize for getting upset. I know you and Dad are trying to make the best decisions for everyone involved." The relief in her voice was immediate and obvious. "Oh, Natasha, I'm so glad you called. Your father and I have been worried that we handled things badly. We never wanted to hurt your feelings, and we certainly didn't want you to think we were excluding you from important family decisions. I understand that this situation with Marcus is complicated, I continued, and I appreciate that you're trying to help him get back on his feet. I just want to make sure that you've considered all the angles before you commit to such a major financial decision. Well, of course we have, she said, though there was a note of uncertainty in her voice that suggested otherwise. Marcus has shown us all the paperwork from the restaurant, and he's confident that with just a little help he can turn things around. Has he shown you the paperwork from his creditors as well? I mean, has he given you a complete picture of exactly how much he owes and to whom? There was a pause, the kind of silence that spoke volumes about conversations that hadn't happened, and questions that hadn't been asked. He's dealing with some temporary cash flow issues, my mother said finally, but nothing that can't be resolved once the restaurant reopens. Mom, I drove by Fusion Flavors yesterday, and it looked like it's been closed for weeks. There was a pile of mail by the door and dust on the window. Are you sure Marcus has been completely honest with you about the current state of his business? Another pause, longer this time. He mentioned that he'd had to close temporarily for some renovations, she said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. He's using this time to reorganize and plan his reopening strategy. What kind of renovations require closing the entire restaurant for weeks? And why would he be asking for $60,000 if he's just doing renovation? I think you should talk to Marcus about these details, my mother said, her tone becoming defensive. He's the one with the business expertise, and he's the one who understands what needs to be done. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with me asking gentle but pointed questions about their financial planning and my mother providing increasingly vague answers that revealed just how little they actually knew about the situation they were committing themselves to. It became clear that they'd made their decision based on Marcus's assurances rather than independent verification of his claims, and that they had no backup plan if their assumptions proved to be incorrect. When I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of sadness and frustration that had become familiar over the years. My parents weren't stupid people, but their love for Marcus had made them willfully blind to information that contradicted their desire to help him. They'd chosen to believe his version of events, rather than conduct the kind of due diligence they would have insisted on for any other major financial decision. The next morning, I received a call from Diana Hartwell, the real estate agent handling the sale of my parents' house. She'd gotten my number from my mother, who'd apparently decided that I should be kept informed about the progress of the sale even though I'd been excluded from the decision-making process. I wanted to let you know that we've received an offer on your parents' property, Diana said, her voice bubbling with the enthusiasm of someone anticipating a quick commission. It's a cash offer from a young family, and they're willing to close within 3 weeks. Your parents are thrilled because it fits perfectly with their timeline for the Sunset Meadows purchase. That's very fast, I said, opening a new document on my computer to take notes. Are you sure the buyers can actually close that quickly? Cash offers sometimes fall through when people realize they can't get their financing arranged in time. Oh, this is definitely a cash transaction, Diana assured me. The buyers are relocating from California, and they've already been approved for a mortgage assumption at Sunset Meadows. Everything is aligning perfectly for everyone involved. Mortgage assumption? I asked, my pulse quickening. What exactly does that mean? Well, your parents' buyers are taking over the existing mortgage on the Sunset Meadows property. It's a bit unusual, but it allows your parents to complete their purchase without having to qualify for new financing. The current mortgage holder has already approved the assumption, so it's just a matter of transferring the paperwork. I ended the call as quickly as possible without arousing suspicion, my mind racing through the implications of what Diana had just told me. My parents' buyers weren't just purchasing their house, they were also assuming the mortgage I owned on the Sunset Meadows property. The young family from California had apparently been approved for the mortgage assumption by the current holder, which meant they'd been approved by me through the property management company that handled my mortgage portfolio. The irony was breathtaking. Not only did I own the mortgage on my parents' retirement home, but I'd inadvertently approved the financing that would allow them to complete their purchase. The young family's application had crossed my desk weeks ago as part of a routine review of assumption requests, and I'd approved it based on their strong credit score and substantial down payment. I'd had no idea at the time that they were planning to use the transaction to facilitate my parents' financial disaster. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the assumption paperwork, trying to understand exactly how the pieces would fit together if the transactions proceeded as planned. The young family would pay my parents approximately $400,000 for their house, and my parents would use that money to pay the entry fee at Sunset Meadows and cover Marcus's immediate debt. The family would then assume the mortgage I owned on the Sunset Meadows property, making payments directly to the management company that handled my portfolio. It was an elegant financial arrangement that would accomplish everyone's stated objectives while completely concealing the fact that the mortgage payments would ultimately be flowing to the daughter who'd been excluded from the family's financial plan. My parents would get their retirement home and the cash they needed to help Marcus. Marcus would get temporary relief from his creditors, and the young family would get a house in a desirable neighborhood. Everyone would be happy, at least until the underlying problems that had created the crisis reasserted themselves. But I wasn't ready to let the transactions proceed as planned. Too many questions remained unanswered, and too many people were making decisions based on incomplete information. The young family deserved to know that they were buying a house from people who were using the proceeds to subsidize a failed business venture. Marcus deserved to confront the reality of his financial situation rather than being enabled to continue making poor decisions. And my parents deserved to understand the full scope of the risks they were taking with their financial security. Most importantly, I deserved to have my voice heard in decisions that affected the family I'd grown up in, and the house that represented 32 years of shared history. They'd tried to exclude me from the conversation, but the financial relationships I'd unknowingly created meant that I was already a central player in the drama they were orchestrating. I called James Park, my attorney, and asked him to schedule a meeting for the following week to discuss my options for influencing the pending transaction. I also called Patricia Wong at First National Bank and asked her to pull together information about my parents' current financial position, including any loans or guarantees they might have signed related to Marcus's business venture. Then I called Zoe and asked her to clear her schedule for Saturday afternoon. It was time to visit Marcus's restaurant in person, to see for myself exactly what our parents were preparing to sacrifice their financial security to say. I'd gathered enough information from documents and phone calls, but I needed to witness the reality of the situation with my own eyes before I decided how to proceed. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Zoe asked when I explained my plan. "Once you see how bad things really are, you won't be able to pretend that you don't know the truth." "I stopped pretending about a lot of things this week," I replied, staring out my office window at the city spreading out below. "It's time to start dealing with reality, even if it's uncomfortable for everyone involved." The drive to Millbrook on Saturday morning felt like a journey into a past I'd thought I'd left behind years ago. Zoe rode with me, providing the kind of moral support that came from having a witness to your family's dysfunction, who wasn't invested in maintaining polite fictions about how functional everyone was supposed to be. We stopped for coffee in downtown Portland and drove through the rolling hills of the Willamette Valley while discussing strategy and possible outcomes. "What's your end game here?" Zoe asked as we passed the exit for my parents' neighborhood. "Are you trying to save them from themselves, or are you trying to teach them a lesson about excluding you from important decisions?" "Both," I admit. "I want to prevent them from destroying their financial security, but I also want them to understand that love and respect aren't the same thing. You can't claim to love someone while simultaneously dismissing their intelligence and excluding them from decisions that affect their life. And if they refuse to listen to you, if they're so committed to helping Marcus that they won't consider alternative approaches, then they'll learn that excluding me from their decision-making process doesn't actually eliminate my ability to influence the outcome of their decision. It just means they won't know what's coming until it's too late to change course." When we reached downtown Millbrook, the full scope of Marcus's failure became immediately apparent. Fusion Flavors sat in the middle of a block that looked like it had been abandoned by economic prosperity years ago. Half the storefronts displayed for rent signs, and the businesses that remained open had the desperate, cluttered appearance of establishments that were barely hanging on to viability. The restaurant itself looked worse than I'd imagined when I'd driven by earlier in the week. The windows were covered with brown paper from the inside, blocking any view of the interior. A handwritten sign taped to the door announced that they were temporarily closed for kitchen improvements, but the edges of the paper were curled and faded as if it had been there for months. Mail and advertising flyers were scattered around the entrance, and the small outdoor seating area was stacked with plastic chairs that looked like they hadn't been moved in weeks. "This is what they're destroying their financial security to say," Zoe asked, standing on the sidewalk across from the restaurant. "It looks like it's been closed since the Clinton administration." I walked closer to the building, peering through gaps in the paper covering the windows to get a glimpse of the interior. What I could see looked like a restaurant that had been abandoned in the middle of service, with tables still set with placemats and salt shakers, chairs pushed back as if customers had just left, and a general air of suspended animation that suggested the closure had been sudden and unplanned. A woman emerged from the bakery next door, carrying a bag of what smelled like fresh croissants. She was in her 60s, with the kind of practical appearance that suggested she'd been running a small business for most of her adult life. When she saw us standing in front of Fusion Flavors, she shook her head with the weary expression of someone who'd watched too many dreams die in the same location. "You thinking about renting the space?" she asked, approaching us with the cautious friendliness of someone who'd learned to be skeptical of optimistic entrepreneurs. "I hate to be negative, but that location has been cursed for the past 5 years. 3 different restaurants have tried to make it work and they all closed within a year. We're actually friends of the family that owns Fusion Flavors," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Do you know what happened to them?" The woman's expression softened with sympathy. "Nice young man, but he was in way over his head from the beginning. The rent on this space is reasonable, but you still need customers to pay it, and this part of downtown just doesn't get the foot traffic to support a restaurant anymore. He tried really hard, I'll give him that, but trying hard doesn't pay the bills." "How long has it been closed?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. The landlord came by last month and changed the locks, so I'm assuming they're officially done. "It's a shame, really." The young man seemed to care about the food, but caring about food and understanding the restaurant business are 2 different things. We spent another hour walking through downtown Millbrook, talking to business owners and getting a sense of the economic conditions that had contributed to Marcus's failure. The picture that emerged was of a community that had been struggling with declining commercial activity for years, as shopping patterns shifted toward larger towns and online retail. The restaurants that survived were the ones that had been established for decades and had developed loyal customer bases that could sustain them through economic downturn. Marcus had chosen one of the most challenging possible locations for a new restaurant, in a town that couldn't support the restaurants it already had, with a concept that required higher prices than the local market could bear. His failure hadn't been the result of bad luck or market cadence beyond his control. It had been the predictable outcome of poor research, inadequate planning, and unrealistic expectations about consumer behavior. By the time we drove back to Portland that afternoon, I had all the information I needed to understand exactly why my parents' plan to save Marcus's business was doomed to fail. The restaurant couldn't be saved because it had never been viable in the first place. The location was wrong, the market was inadequate, and the financial obligations were too substantial to overcome with a one-time cash infusion. More importantly, I'd confirmed that Marcus either didn't understand the fundamental problems with his business model, or was deliberately misleading our parents about his prospects for success. Either way, their decision to sacrifice their financial security to fund his venture was based on information that ranged from incomplete to delusional. As I drove through the darkening countryside toward the city lights of Portland, I realized that the time for gentle questions and subtle investigations had passed. My parents were 3 weeks away from completing transactions that would destroy their financial security, and Marcus was apparently unwilling or unable to provide them with honest assessments of his situation. It was time to stop gathering information and start using the power I'd accumulated to force the conversations that everyone had been avoiding. The mortgage I owned gave me leverage that no one suspected, and the knowledge I'd gathered gave me the ability to expose the flaws in their planning that they'd been unwilling to acknowledge. The game was about to change in ways that would surprise everyone involved, And this time, the responsible daughter who'd been excluded from the family's financial planning was going to make sure her voice was heard whether they wanted to listen or not. The morning of the closing arrived with an unseasonably warm October sun that made the maples along Maple Ridge Drive look like they were on fire. I sat in my car across the street from my childhood home, watching as moving trucks and real estate professionals prepared for the transfer of ownership that would change everything for my family. The Castellanos family had arrived early, their children running excitedly through the yard that would soon be theirs while their parents conducted final walkthroughs with Diana Hartwell and a small army of inspectors and appraisers. My parents stood on the front porch, my mother clutching a folder of documents while my father pointed out features of the house to the buyers with the kind of forced enthusiasm that masked deeper emotion. They looked smaller than I remembered, somehow diminished by the weight of the decision they'd made and the finality of what was about to happen. Marcus was notably absent, which wasn't surprising given that the actual work of facilitating the sale would have required him to confront realities about money and legal obligations that he'd spent years avoiding. I'd spent the previous week preparing for this moment, assembling documents and making phone calls that would allow me to control the narrative of what happened next. James Park had helped me structure the legal framework for what I was about to do, ensuring that every action I took would be technically correct and legally defensible. Patricia Wong had provided me with detailed information about my parents' financial position, confirming my suspicions about the extent to which they'd already compromised their security by guaranteeing Marcus's business debt. The closing was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the offices of Morrison, Klein & Associates, the same law firm that had prepared the power of attorney documents giving Marcus control over my parents' affairs. I'd called the morning before and requested a meeting with the senior partner to discuss my concerns about the transaction, identifying myself as a financial professional with expertise in distressed asset management, rather than as the daughter who'd been excluded from the family's decision-making process. At 9:45, I walked into the law offices wearing my most conservative business suit and carrying a leather briefcase that contained everything I needed to demonstrate why the pending transactions were financially catastrophic for everyone involved. The receptionist directed me to a conference room where my parents were already seated at a polished mahogany table surrounded by stacks of documents and looking overwhelmed by the complexity of what they were about to undertake. "Natasha," my mother said, her voice carrying surprise and a note of anxiety that suggested she hadn't expected to see me there. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to make sure you understand exactly what you're committing to," I replied, setting my briefcase on the table and taking the seat directly across from them, "and to provide you with some information about your financial situation that I don't think you've fully considered." My father frowned, glancing at the power of attorney documents as if they were a shield that could protect him from uncomfortable conversations. "Marcus is handling all the details of this transaction. He has our complete confidence and our legal authority to act on our behalf." "Where is Marcus?" I asked, looking around the conference room as if I expected him to materialize from behind a filing cabinet. Shouldn't the person with power of attorney be present for a transaction this significant? The question hung in the air for a moment, highlighting an absence that neither of my parents seemed prepared to explain. Finally, my mother cleared her throat and said, "He had some business matters to attend to this morning. He'll join us if we need him." "Business matters," I repeated, opening my briefcase and removing a folder of documents I'd prepared. "Speaking of business matters, I've been doing some research into Marcus's current financial situation, and I think there are some things you should know before you proceed with this transaction." Before either of them could respond, the conference room door opened and Diana Hartwell entered, followed by the Castellanos family and their attorney. The mood in the room immediately shifted from family tension to professional efficiency, as the real estate agent began distributing closing documents and explaining the sequence of signatures and payments that would complete the sale. I sat quietly through the first part of the process, watching as my parents signed document after document transferring ownership of their home to strangers who seemed genuinely excited about starting their new life in Millbrook. The house sale itself was straightforward, with the Castellanos family providing a cashier's check for $410,000 in exchange for a clear title and immediate possession. It was when Diana began explaining the next phase of the transaction that I decided to intervene. "Before my parents commit to the Sunset Meadows purchase," I said, my voice cutting through the gentle murmur of professional conversation. I think everyone in this room should understand the full scope of the financial obligations they're taking on. Diana looked confused, glancing between me and my parents as if she wasn't sure who had the authority to raise concerns about a transaction that had already been negotiated and approved. I'm sorry, but who are you exactly? Are you representing the sellers in some capacity? I'm their daughter, I said, removing a business card from my briefcase and sliding it across the table to her. And I'm also a financial analyst who specializes in distressed asset management. I have some serious concerns about the viability of this transaction. My father's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Natasha, this is neither the time nor the place for this conversation. We've made our decision, and Marcus has the legal authority to execute our wish. Actually, I said, opening the folder I'd brought and removing the first set of documents. I think this is exactly the time and place for this conversation, especially since I have information about your financial situation that I don't think Marcus has shared with you. I placed a detailed analysis of Marcus's outstanding debts on the table, organized by creditor and showing total obligations that exceeded $120,000. The numbers were stark and undeniable, culled from public records and credit reports that painted a picture of financial collapse far more severe than anything my parents had acknowledged. These are Marcus's current business debts, I explained, my voice taking on the professional tone I used when presenting investment analyses to clients. As you can see, the $60,000 you're planning to give him won't even bring his accounts current, let alone provide the working capital he'd need to reopen his restaurant. My mother stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, her fingers tracing the numbers that added up to a sum that dwarfed anything they'd discussed as a family. This can't be right, she said weakly. Marcus told us his debts were manageable, just temporary cash flow problems. I'm afraid it gets worse, I continued, removing another set of documents from my folder. These are the personal guarantees you've signed for several of Marcus's business loans. If his restaurant fails to make payments, which it obviously can't since it's been closed for 2 months, the creditors can come after your personal assets to satisfy the debt. The second set of documents hit the table like a bomb, exposing financial obligations that my parents had apparently signed without fully understanding their implications. The personal guarantees meant that Marcus's business debts were effectively their personal debts, creating legal obligations that could force them into bankruptcy if they couldn't satisfy the creditor's demand. Diana Hartwell looked increasingly uncomfortable as the family drama unfolded in her conference room, but the Castellanos family attorney was taking notes with the focused attention of someone who recognized the potential for legal complications that could affect his client's interest. This is highly irregular, the attorney said, looking at Diana with the kind of expression that suggested billable hours and potential liability issues. Are the sellers in a position to complete this transaction, or are there financial encumbrances that could affect the title transfer? The house sale is clean, I assured him, recognizing that the innocent buyers shouldn't be penalized for my family's dysfunction. The property has no liens or encumbrances that would affect your client's ownership. The financial issues I'm discussing relate to my parents' other obligations and their plans for using the proceeds from this sale. My father was reading through the debt analysis with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the scope of the crisis they'd created. How did you get this information? He asked, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and bewilderment. These are private financial matters. Most of this information is available through public records and credit reports, I replied. The personal guarantees you signed are filed with the county clerk, and Marcus's business debts are documented in court filings and collection actions. I didn't need access to private information to discover what you should have known before you agreed to help him. The room fell silent, except for the sound of papers rustling as my parents continued to review the evidence of their son's financial collapse. The Castellanos family waited patiently, their attorney whispering explanations about what was happening and why it might affect their transaction. Diana Hartwell looked like she wanted to crawl under the conference table and disappear. Even if these numbers are accurate, my mother said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, we can't abandon Marcus when he needs our help the most. Family means supporting each other through difficult times. Supporting family doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior, I replied, removing the final set of documents from my briefcase. And it definitely doesn't mean destroying your own financial security to subsidize someone else's poor decisions. The last documents I placed on the table were the most devastating of all: a comprehensive analysis of my parents' retirement income and expenses that showed how the Sunset Meadows purchase would consume virtually all of their liquid assets, while saddle them with monthly payments they couldn't afford on my father's pension. The numbers were unforgiving, demonstrating that even without Marcus's debts, their plan to purchase the retirement home would leave them financially vulnerable and unable to handle any unexpected expenses. This analysis shows your projected income and expenses if you proceed with the Sunset Meadows purchase, I explained, pointing to the relevant sections of the spreadsheet. As you can see, the monthly carrying costs will consume 87% of your pension income, leaving you with virtually no margin for emergencies or unexpected expenses. My father studied the numbers with the kind of attention he'd once devoted to hardware store inventory sheets, his engineering mind automatically checking my calculations and finding them disturbingly accurate. These projections assume that we'll be paying the full mortgage amount, he said, grasping for some flaw in my analysis that might invalidate its conclusion. Actually, I said, allowing myself a small smile that probably looked predatory in the conference room lighting, that brings me to the most important piece of information I need to share with you today. I reached into my briefcase and removed a folder marked with the logo of Pacific Northwest Asset Management, the shell company I'd established for my mortgage acquisition business. Inside was the complete documentation of my purchase of the Sunset Meadows mortgage, including the auction records, payment history, and current account status. 6 months ago, I said, my voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering news that would change everything. The mortgage on your Sunset Meadows property was sold at auction to a collection agency after the original borrowers defaulted on their payment. I purchased that mortgage as part of a portfolio of distressed assets. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, filling the conference room with implications that no one seemed able to process immediately. My parents stared at the documents as if they were artifacts from an alien civilization, unable to comprehend how their daughter had become their creditor without their knowledge. "You own our mortgage?" my mother asked, her voice carrying the kind of disbelief that people reserve for impossibly unlikely coincidences. "I own the mortgage on the property you're planning to purchase," I clarified, "which means that any mortgage assumption or refinancing requires my approval as the current lender. It also means that I have the authority to modify the terms of the loan or accelerate payment, if I determine that the borrowers represent an unacceptable risk." Diana Hartwell looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "This is unprecedented," she said, fumbling through her files as if she could find some procedure for dealing with situations where family members owned each other's mortgages. "I've never encountered a situation where the seller's daughter owned the buyer's mortgage. I'm not even sure how to proceed with the closing." The Castellanos family attorney was taking notes furiously, recognizing that he was witnessing the kind of family drama that would require careful documentation to protect his client's interest. "Does this affect our ability to complete the house purchase?" he asked. "My clients have already made arrangements for their moving truck and started their children in new schools. The house sale can proceed as planned," I assured him. "My ownership of the Sunset Meadows mortgage doesn't affect your client's transaction with my parents. However, it does significantly complicate my parents' ability to complete their own purchase." My father was beginning to understand the implications of what I'd revealed. "You're saying that you have the power to prevent us from buying the retirement home." "I'm saying that as the current mortgage holder, I have the right to approve or deny any assumption of the loan," I replied. "And based on the financial analysis I've shared with you today, I cannot in good conscience approve a mortgage assumption for borrowers who are planning to use their liquid assets to pay off someone else's business debt." The silence that followed was heavy with 32 years of family history, and the sudden realization that the daughter they'd excluded from their financial planning had positioned herself to control the outcome of their decision. My parents looked at each other with the kind of expression that couples exchange when they realize they've made a catastrophic miscalculation. "What do you want?" my father asked finally, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who'd just discovered that he'd been outmaneuvered by an opponent he hadn't known he was facing. I want you to make financial decisions based on accurate information rather than wishful thinking, I replied. I want you to acknowledge that Marcus's business is beyond salvation, and that throwing money at it will only delay the inevitable while destroying your own financial security. And I want you to understand that excluding me from family decisions doesn't eliminate my ability to influence the outcomes of those decisions. The conference room fell silent again as everyone processed the implications of what I'd said. The Castellanos family was whispering among themselves, probably wondering if they'd accidentally wandered into the middle of a Shakespearean tragedy instead of a routine real estate closing. Diana Hartwell was staring at her files as if they might contain instructions for managing family financial warfare. "We need to discuss this as a family," my mother said finally, her voice carrying the kind of defeat that comes from realizing that years of careful planning had just collapsed in a matter of minutes. "Actually," I said, checking my watch and noting that it was nearly noon, "we need to discuss this right now. The closing on your house sale needs to be completed today if you want to avoid penalties for delay, and the Sunset Meadows purchase contract expires at the end of the week. If we're going to find a solution that works for everyone, we need to address these issues immediately." I opened my briefcase one final time and removed a document I'd spent the previous evening preparing with James Park's assistant. It was a comprehensive financial restructuring plan that would allow my parents to complete their retirement home purchase, while protecting them from Marcus's creditors and ensuring that they retained enough liquid assets to maintain their financial security. "This is a proposal for how we can resolve the current crisis," I said, placing the document in the center of the table where everyone could see it. "It addresses your desire to help Marcus, while protecting your own financial interests and ensuring that you can afford the retirement lifestyle you want." The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of giving Marcus $60,000 in cash that would disappear into the black hole of his existing debts, my parents would purchase his outstanding obligations directly from his creditors at a significant discount. This would eliminate his legal liability for the debts, while allowing my parents to negotiate payment plans they could actually afford. The money they saved through debt negotiation would be held in trust to cover their monthly expenses at Sunset Meadows, ensuring that they had adequate reserves for emergencies and unexpected costs. Most importantly, the proposal included a provision that would transfer Marcus's power of attorney back to my parents, restoring their control over their own financial affairs, while requiring family consultation for any major decisions that affected their shared interests. "This plan eliminates Marcus's business debts, protects your retirement security, and allows you to complete the Sunset Meadows purchase," I explained, watching as my parents read through the details with growing comprehension. "It also ensures that you'll have adequate reserves to handle any unexpected expenses, without having to worry about losing your home." My father looked up from the document with an expression that mixed admiration with something that might have been "You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've spent my entire career analyzing financial problems and developing solutions that protect my clients' interests," I replied. "I just never imagined that I'd need to apply those skills to prevent my own family from destroying their financial security." Diana Hartwell was reading through the proposal with the focused attention of someone who recognized a lifeline when she saw one. "This could actually work," she said, looking up from the document with renewed optimism. "If you can negotiate the debt purchases and establish the trust fund, your parents could complete both transactions without compromising their financial stability." The Castellanos family attorney nodded his approval. "This arrangement protects our clients' interests, while allowing the sellers to complete their own transaction. From a legal standpoint, it resolves the complications that could have prevented both closings from proceeding." My mother was still staring at the proposal as if she couldn't quite believe that a solution existed for the crisis that had seemed insurmountable just minutes earlier. "What about Marcus?" she asked. "How do we explain to him that we're taking control of his debts, instead of giving him the money he asked for?" "We explain that we're helping him in a way that actually solves his problems instead of enabling his mistakes," I replied. "Eliminating his debts gives him a clean slate to start over, but it also ensures that he'll have to build his next venture with his own resources instead of relying on family money he can't afford to lose." My father was nodding slowly as he continued to read through the financial projections that accompanied the proposal. This plan actually leaves us in better financial shape than we were before Marcus's restaurant failed, he said with something approaching wonder. How is that possible? Because buying distressed debts at discount allows you to eliminate obligations for a fraction of their face value, I explained. Instead of paying $60,000 to creditors who would use it to pursue Marcus for the remaining balance, you'll pay perhaps $20,000 to purchase the debts outright and eliminate them completely. The transformation in the conference room was remarkable. What had begun as a routine real estate closing had evolved into a family financial crisis and was now resolving into a comprehensive solution that addressed everyone's interests while protecting the people who mattered most. The Castellanos family was relieved that their house purchase could proceed as planned. Diana Hartwell was thrilled that both transactions could be completed without legal complication, and my parents were beginning to understand that their daughter's exclusion from their planning had been their loss rather than hers. There's one more thing, I said, removing the final document from my briefcase. As part of this arrangement, I'm prepared to modify the terms of your Sunset Meadows mortgage to reduce your monthly payments and extend the repayment period. This will further improve your cash flow and ensure that you can afford your retirement lifestyle without financial stress. The mortgage modification would reduce their monthly payments by nearly $400 while extending the loan term by 5 years. It was a generous arrangement that reflected both my desire to help my family and my recognition that punitive terms would serve no constructive purpose. As the afternoon wore on and the various documents were signed and notarized, the atmosphere in the conference room shifted from crisis management to cautious optimism. The house sale was completed on schedule, with the Castellanos family taking possession of my childhood home and expressing genuine excitement about their new life in Millbrook. The Sunset Meadows purchase was restructured according to my proposal, with new financing terms that protected my parents' financial security while allowing them to complete their retirement transition. Most importantly, the family dynamic that had excluded me from important decisions was replaced by an arrangement that required consultation and consensus for any major financial commitment. The power of attorney that had given Marcus control over our parents' affairs was revoked and replaced with a family trust structure that distributed decision-making authority more equitably. When the last document was signed and the final check was deposited, my parents and I found ourselves alone in the conference room, surrounded by the paperwork that documented the end of one chapter of our family's story and the beginning of another. I owe you an apology, my father said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that came from understanding how badly he'd misjudged the situation. We should have included you in these decisions from the beginning. Your expertise could have prevented this entire crisis. We should have trusted your judgment instead of dismissing your concerns, my mother added, her eyes bright with tears that might have been relief or gratitude or simple exhaustion. You saved us from making a terrible mistake, and you did it even after we'd excluded you from the family discussion. I looked around the conference room at the documents that represented months of planning and negotiation, the evidence of financial crisis averted and family relationships restructured. I didn't do this to prove a point about family dynamics, I said, though even as I spoke the words I knew they weren't entirely true. I did it because I love you both too much to watch you destroy your financial security for the sake of enabling Marcus's mistake. The drive back to Portland that evening felt different than any journey I'd taken in years. The landscape looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with the family I'd grown up loving and resenting in equal measure. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my voice had been heard and my expertise had been valued by the people whose approval I'd spent decades trying to earn. The childhood home that had been sold that morning would always hold memories of who I'd been before I learned to be independent and self-reliant. But the family relationships that had been restructured in that conference room held the possibility of something better, something more honest and more equitable than what we'd had before. As I pulled into the parking garage of my downtown building, I realized that revenge had never been the goal. Justice had been the objective, and justice had been served in the form of financial security restored and family dynamics realigned. The little girl who'd learned to solve her own problems had grown into a woman with the resources and knowledge to solve other people's problems too, even when those people were the family members who'd taught her that she couldn't depend on anyone but herself. 3 months later, I found myself standing in the kitchen of my parents' new townhouse at Sunset Meadows, watching my mother prepare Sunday dinner with the kind of relaxed confidence I hadn't seen in her for years. The kitchen was smaller than the one in their old house, but it was filled with natural light and equipped with modern appliances that made cooking seem effortless rather than burdensome. Through the window, I could see my father on the golf course, his swing looking more fluid than it had in decades. The transformation in their daily routine had been remarkable to witness. Without the constant stress of maintaining a large house and managing Marcus's financial crises, they'd rediscovered interests and activities they'd abandoned years earlier. My mother had joined the community garden club and was learning watercolor painting. My father had become a regular at the woodworking shop and had started teaching basic carpentry to some of the younger residents. The debt consolidation company called yesterday, my mother said, stirring a pot of soup that smelled like childhood comfort. They've successfully negotiated settlements with all of Marcus's creditors. The final payment will be less than $18,000, which means we'll have saved over $40,000 compared to what he originally owed. The debt negotiation process had taken longer than anyone had anticipated, but the results had exceeded even my optimistic projection. By purchasing Marcus's obligations directly from his creditors, rather than giving him cash to pay them himself, my parents had been able to negotiate settlements that eliminated his debts for roughly 15 cents on the dollar. The money they'd saved had been invested in a conservative portfolio that generated monthly income to supplement their retirement funds. How is Marcus handling the transition? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer based on the family phone calls that had become increasingly strained over the past few weeks. My mother's expression grew thoughtful, the kind of careful neutrality that parents develop when discussing children who've disappointed them. He's struggling with the reality that he can't simply restart another restaurant venture with family money. The job market for experienced restaurant managers is better than he expected, but the starting salaries are significantly lower than what he was hoping to earn. Marcus had spent the first month after the debt elimination in a state of denial, apparently convinced that our parents would eventually provide him with startup capital for another business venture. When it became clear that the new family financial structure included oversight and accountability measures that made such investments impossible, he'd been forced to confront the reality that his entrepreneurial dreams would have to be funded with his own resources, rather than family subsidy. The adjustment had been difficult for everyone involved. Marcus had alternated between anger at being cut off from the family financial support system and resentment toward me for implementing safeguards that prevented him from accessing funds for speculative venture. Our parents had struggled with their own feelings about establishing boundaries that felt harsh but necessary for everyone's long-term well-being. He's applied for a position as assistant manager at a restaurant chain in Salem, my mother continued, her voice carrying the kind of cautious optimism that suggested she was trying not to get her hopes up. It's not the creative freedom he wanted, but it would give him steady income and benefits while he figures out his next steps. I nodded, recognizing that steady employment represented progress even if it wasn't the dramatic success story Marcus had envisioned for himself. The restaurant industry was notoriously difficult, and working for someone else's establishment would give him insights into operational realities that he'd never gained while trying to run his own business. The sound of the front door opening interrupted our conversation, followed by my father's voice calling out that he'd brought a guest for dinner. I assumed he'd invited one of his golf partners until Marcus walked into the kitchen, his expression carefully neutral, and his posture suggesting he was prepared for potential conflict. "Natasha," he said, nodding in my direction with the kind of formal politeness that people use when they're not sure whether they're talking to a friend or an adversary. "I didn't know you were going to be here today." "I come for dinner most Sundays now," I replied, trying to match his neutral tone while being honest about the new family routines that had developed since the financial restructure. "Mom's been experimenting with new recipes, and I think she likes having an audience for her culinary adventures." The conversation that followed was awkward but civil, a careful dance around topics that had caused explosions just months earlier. Marcus asked about my work without betraying any interest in my financial advice. I inquired about his job search without offering unsolicited opinions about his career choice. Our parents facilitated the interaction with the kind of determined cheerfulness that suggested they were grateful for any communication that didn't involve accusations or demands for money. It wasn't until after dinner, when we were sitting on the small patio overlooking the golf course, that Marcus finally addressed the elephant that had been lurking in every family conversation since the debt consolidation had been completed. "I know you think I've been irresponsible with money," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "And you're probably right, that my business plans weren't as realistic as I believed they were." I waited for him to continue, recognizing that this was likely the closest thing to an acknowledgement of his mistakes that I was going to receive. Marcus had never been comfortable with admitting errors, and the fact that he was even approaching the topic suggested significant personal growth. "But I need you to understand that I never intended to put Mom and Dad's financial security at risk," he continued, his eyes focused on the golfers moving across the distant fairway. "I genuinely believed that the restaurant could succeed, and I thought the money they were lending me would be paid back with interest once the business got established." "I understand that your intentions were good," I replied, choosing my words carefully to avoid reigniting the conflicts that had dominated our family interactions for years. "But good intentions don't eliminate the consequences of poor plans. Mom and Dad were prepared to sacrifice their retirement security to bail you out of debts that couldn't be resolved with the amount of money they were offering." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, processing the reality that his financial crisis had been more severe than he'd acknowledged even to himself. "How bad was it really?" he asked finally. "I know you showed them documents about my debts, but I never saw the complete analysis." I pulled out my phone and opened the financial summary I'd prepared for the debt negotiation process. The numbers were stark and undeniable, showing obligations that exceeded his annual earning potential by a factor of 3, and payment schedules that would have required him to dedicate virtually all of his income to debt service for over a decade. "These are your outstanding obligations as of 3 months ago," I said, handing him the phone so he could review the details himself. "As you can see, the $60,000 Mom and Dad were planning to give you wouldn't have solved your problem. It would have delayed the inevitable while depleting their savings." Marcus studied the screen with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was finally ready to confront realities he'd been avoiding. "I had no idea the equipment leases had accelerated," he said quietly. "I thought I had more time to work out payment arrangements. Equipment leasing companies don't negotiate when restaurants close," I explained. "They repossess what they can and demand payment for the remainder. The personal guarantees you signed made you liable for the full amount regardless of whether the equipment could be resold." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus asking questions about financial concepts he'd never understood, and me providing explanations that I hoped would help him make better decisions in the future. It wasn't a warm reconciliation, but it was the beginning of a more honest relationship based on mutual respect rather than enabling and resentment. As the evening progressed, I began to understand that the financial crisis had served as a catalyst for changes that went far beyond the immediate problem of Marcus's debt. Our parents had been forced to confront their own patterns of enabling behavior and establish boundaries that protected their financial security while still expressing their love for their children. Marcus had been compelled to face the consequences of his poor decision-making and develop more realistic expectations about business ownership and financial responsibility. Most importantly, the family dynamic that had excluded me from important conversations had been replaced by a structure that valued my expertise while respecting everyone's autonomy. The monthly family financial meetings that were now part of our routine felt like genuine collaborations rather than lectures or interventions. When I prepared to leave that evening, my parents walked me to my car with the kind of easy familiarity that suggested these Sunday dinners had become an important part of their weekly routine. The conversation flowed naturally between updates about their retirement activities, questions about my work, and planning for upcoming family gatherings that would include Marcus without revolving around his latest financial crisis. "I've been thinking about something," my father said as I opened my car door. "You've spent years building expertise in financial management, And you used that knowledge to save our family from a disaster we didn't even realize we were creating. But we never really acknowledged that or thanked you properly for what you did. You don't need to thank me, I replied, though the recognition meant more than I was comfortable admitting. I couldn't stand by and watch you destroy your financial security, especially when I had the resources to prevent it from happening. But that's exactly the point, my mother interjected. You had resources we didn't know about, and you used them to help us even after we'd excluded you from our decision-making process. A less generous person might have let us make our mistakes and learned from the consequence. I considered her words as I settled into the driver's seat, thinking about the anger and resentment that had motivated my initial investigation into their financial situation. The desire for revenge had certainly been present, but it had been overwhelmed by a deeper commitment to family loyalty that I hadn't fully recognized until the crisis had forced me to examine my own motivations. Family means protecting each other from preventable disasters, I said finally, even when that protection isn't requested or appreciated. Even when it requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable truth. The drive back to Portland felt different than it had 3 months earlier, when I'd been consumed with anger about being excluded from family decisions and frustrated by my parents' willingness to enable Marcus's irresponsibility. The landscape looked the same, but the emotional weight that had pressed down on me for years had lifted, replaced by something that felt like peace rather than resignation. The financial crisis that had threatened to destroy my family's security had ultimately strengthened the relationships that mattered most while eliminating the destructive patterns that had characterized our interactions for decades. Marcus was learning to take responsibility for his own decisions rather than expecting family bailouts for his mistakes. Our parents had established boundaries that expressed love through wisdom rather than unlimited financial support, and I had finally found a way to contribute my expertise to family decisions while maintaining my own independence and self-respect. As I pulled into the parking garage of my downtown building, I reflected on the lesson that the past few months had taught me about the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge would have involved using my knowledge and resources to punish my family for excluding me from their decision. Justice had meant using those same tools to protect them from the consequences of their poor planning, while ensuring that my voice would be heard in future family discussions. The little girl who had learned to solve her own problems because no one else was available to help her had grown into a woman who could solve other people's problems too, but who chose to do so in ways that strengthened relationships rather than settling score. The financial power that could have been used destructively had been channeled into constructive solutions that protected everyone's interests while addressing the underlying issues that had created the crisis. 6 months later, I received a text message from Marcus that included a photo of his first paycheck from his new job as assistant manager at a restaurant chain in Salem. The amount wasn't impressive by my standards, but it represented steady income earned through his own efforts rather than family subsidy. More importantly, it suggested that he was beginning to build the kind of practical experience that might eventually support more realistic entrepreneurial ambitions. The message was brief and factual, but it marked a significant milestone in our relationship. For the first time in years, Marcus was sharing news about his life that reflected progress rather than crisis, achievement rather than disappointment. The steady employment he'd initially seen as a temporary setback had become a source of pride and stability that allowed him to rebuild his confidence without compromising his family's financial security. My parents had settled into their retirement community with the kind of contentment that comes from making decisions based on realistic assessments of their resources and needs. The monthly income from their investment portfolio, combined with the reduced housing costs and eliminated debt obligations, had given them financial flexibility they hadn't enjoyed for years. More importantly, they'd learned to distinguish between supporting their children and enabling their mistakes, a lesson that had improved their relationships with both Marcus and me. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been transformed by the Castellanos family into something that looked familiar but felt completely different. The children had added a swing set to the backyard where I'd once practiced softball, and the garden beds that had showcased my mother's roses now displayed vegetables and herbs that reflected the new family's interest. Driving by occasionally, I felt a sense of closure rather than loss, recognizing that the building had been just a container for memories that I would carry with me regardless of who owned the property. The family relationships that had been restructured during the financial crisis had evolved into something more honest and more sustainable than what we'd had before. The monthly family meetings that had started as crisis management sessions had become opportunities for genuine collaboration and mutual support. Marcus sought financial advice before making major decisions. Our parents included both children in discussions about their long-term plans, and I found myself looking forward to family gatherings rather than enduring them out of obligation. Standing in my office one afternoon, looking out at the Portland skyline and thinking about the changes that had transformed my family over the past year, I realized that the most valuable lesson had been about the difference between being needed and being valued. For years I'd built my identity around being the responsible child who didn't require help, who solved her own problems and asked for nothing in return, but being needed for crisis management wasn't the same as being valued for ongoing contributions to family decisions. The financial crisis had forced my family to recognize that excluding me from important conversations wasn't just hurtful, it was counterproductive. My expertise and resources were assets that could benefit everyone when they were utilized collaboratively rather than ignored until emergencies made them necessary. The power I'd accumulated through my professional success was most valuable when it was used to strengthen relationships rather than settle scores. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.